From a new spy team in Russia to an outbreak in Texas and higher egg prices nationwide, here's just a few interesting stories to put on your radar this week. I'm Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. Well, we're at the end of another big week of news, and we've had a lot of big weeks of news in 2025 and really over the last several years. And we're going to talk about the last several years at the end of this report. But I first want to get to the news stories that really matter. A few stories that I just want to flag for you before you head into your weekend. A story that continues to develop and continues to have a lot of strong feelings attached to it are egg prices. And when we're talking about egg prices, we're also talking about the bird flu. There is a new headline this week, though, and that is that we have a new record high for the price of a dozen eggs. That's $4.95. But when I've asked you what you're paying, many of you are paying $7, $8, $9, $10, upwards of and beyond $10 for a dozen eggs. And a big reason for this is because of the bird flu. When the bird flu infects a flock, it's really contagious. It's very deadly to birds. And because of that, the government has a process for farmers that incentivizes partnering with the government to deal with this outbreak of a flu. And that often involves many times killing the birds to stop the spread. And that's a very unique program. You know, bird flu has been found now in 48 different mammals. So you can have bird flu in bears, bird flu in sea lions, bird flu in dairy cows. But we don't have the same government program for dealing with that because, in part, bird flu isn't as dangerous in these other animals. It can produce a cold or respiratory infection, very similar to a flu. And for dairy cows, for example, it does impact milk production. It can sicken a cow for several weeks, but that doesn't mean that farmers are going to turn around and kill a herd of cows. And so we're in a situation now when it comes to birds, and this is what is affecting egg prices, that there's a reward structure that is leading naturally to more deaths as a way of trying to manage this outbreak of flu. And when you have fewer birds that are producing eggs, the egg prices are going to go higher. And yet the argument on the other side is that without this intervention and a quick culling of a flock, the bird flu could just run through these flocks, decimate these farms, cause even more shortages. So it is a tough situation that the Trump administration is now trying to think about differently. In fact, there was a reference made in an interview, sort of in passing, about the Trump administration looking to change the policy, to move away from the culling of flocks and instead embrace more containment or vaccination policies instead. That does raise other questions about whether or not the public would be open to that, you know, mass vaccinations of bird flocks, for example. But there is a question about how to manage this better and what actually brings egg prices back down. You know, what's interesting about egg prices is that they're a very visible sign. It's very similar to gas prices, that the public sees how much a dozen eggs cost, and it's a sign of inflation, a sign that things have changed. Sometimes the public will absorb that. Other times it can make someone, a shopper, very angry or very aware that prices are much higher than they previously were. So this is about egg prices. It is about egg shortages. It is about bird flu, but there's also an inflationary indicator here that makes this story bigger than just a dozen eggs. The other big picture here is that there's always a concern by health officials about the bird flu spreading to us, to people. And we've seen a few cases, but we haven't seen that widespread, and we have not seen human to human transmission. This is a big area of concern and a big question about the unknown. And it's one of the reasons why we're keeping an eye on this story about bird flu. Speaking of an outbreak of disease, though, you may have heard about an outbreak of measles in Texas. And let's talk about what we know and what we don't know. First of all, I was very curious about this term outbreak. You know, what makes an outbreak? And one of the reasons why I was asking that question is because of what I've learned during the pandemic. When we first started to use the word pandemic, it sounded very serious, very, very scary. Pandemic refers to the pervasiveness of a disease, you know, how widespread it is, not how serious it is, although we often attach that to the word. And we do the same thing with outbreak. So I wanted to know, you know, what is the actual definition of outbreak? Turns out the outbreak definition by the CDC is the following: when there are more disease cases than what is usually expected for a certain time frame or location or population. So you can see in many ways there, it's a little bit arbitrary, because could an outbreak be 5 cases when you typically have 0? You see what I mean? So it's important to have the context here. So let's keep it in mind when we're talking about this outbreak of measles cases in West Texas. It's happening in a rural area near the New Mexico border. In fact, We're also getting reports that we're seeing measles cases as well in New Mexico now. And it seems to be unrelated to this particular group in West Texas, but again, they're still investigating and figuring it out. The latest information from the Texas Department of Health is that we had 58 cases in this area of West Texas, mainly young people, from infancy to just under 18 years old. And right away, the reporting turns to vaccination rates for obvious reasons, because we do know that a measles vaccine is available. So here's what the health department says. 4 of the cases are vaccinated. The rest are unvaccinated or their vaccination status is unknown. A separate report puts vaccination rates in this area between 80 and 85%. So it's not 10 or 20%, it's between 80 and 85%, but that's below the recommendation from the government for herd immunity. The government wants to see vaccination rates closer to 95%. The measles vaccine is not 100% effective. We do know that there's 4 cases amongst the 58 that are vaccinated people. And there's a lack of clarity about the vaccination status of others. So again, just something to watch. And while there's so much focus on vaccines, there's a part of the story that hasn't really been covered, which is in this rural area, where did the measles come from? How did we get the measles outbreak in this particular community? In a place like New York, where you're getting high travelers from all parts of the world and you're in very tight spaces and you know that the measles are very contagious, that's always a question that comes up. But we're not really seeing that covered here. And it's a question that I have that I'm going to continue to look into. Speaking of a story, though, that we should know about, the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting piece in their weekend edition that I can't stop thinking about, that I want to flag for you because it does tie into the news of the week. And it's about a secret spy agency in Russia, a new unit that they're calling it. And apparently it's not secret anymore because the Wall Street Journal is reporting about it. But the description of the department, or the title, is the Department of Special Tasks. Okay. The acronym is SSD in Russian. The SSD apparently was created in 2023 at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And this is a department that the Wall Street Journal did extensive reporting on that really no one else has. But you should know that Russia really denies this whole thing. I think it's important that you know that, but here's what the Wall Street Journal says. The SSD has at least 3 broad tasks, according to Western intelligence officials: carrying out killings, sabotage overseas, infiltrating Western companies and universities, and recruiting and training foreign agents. The Wall Street Journal goes on to report that there's an understanding based on this group and also just the way that Russia's operating right now generally, and the Wall Street Journal was quoting experts related to this, that Russia views the war that they're currently engaged in with Ukraine as a war against the West. It's a war against the West in its totality, not just a war against a country. And the Wall Street Journal introduced some voices in this piece that suggested that America needs a wartime footing because of this, because of the SSD, because that these operatives are moving around Europe doing things like setting fires at malls or supermarket or places that they want to target, ammunition factories, things like that, planning assassinations. So it's just something to be aware of. And it's something to consider as we see a new position by the Trump administration, because we're getting very different points of view. When it comes to foreign policy overall, there are 2 ways that foreign policy seems to be pursued. There's engagement or there's isolation. And engagement is diplomacy. We're talking, we're communicating, we're engaging with each other. Isolation is we're going to shun the other party. We're going to isolate them socially and economically and beyond. We're going to punish them. They're going to try to suffocate them to bring you to that table and try to figure out whatever the end is of whatever chapter we're discussing. There's a debate about the efficacy of both of these strategies that predates the times that we're in. But part of the reason why the Trump administration's new posture is getting so much news is because it's changing what America did over the last several years. America was trying to isolate Russia and was working in tandem with Europe when it came to that. And now the Trump administration is trying to engage Russia. So it's a change. This is why Ukraine is nervous, why European leaders are nervous, because it's also bringing up a question about what winning looks like when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine. What does winning look like for Russia? What does winning look like for Ukraine? What does winning look like for Europe? What does it look like for the Trump administration? Do we all have different ideas of winning? And if that's the case, then how do we get to peace? What defines a win? And that's a key question to ask as we're going to mark 3 complete years of the war in Ukraine just over the next several days. So just something to think about here. Speaking of marking the passing of time, we marked 7 years of Smarter News this week. And I'm always thinking about ways to make the news work for you again. I don't want you to work to get the news. I want the news to work for you. And I want you to love the news, not hate it. I believe in journalism. I believe in a free press. And the world is a really amazing place. It can be sad. It can be difficult. It can be challenging, but it can be amazing too. And when I set out to create this platform back in 2017, 2018, one of the key reasons for that was that the news was just too partisan. There wasn't enough customer service. And it's important that we present stories in a way for you to consider the multiple sides and make up your own mind. So we're always looking for the best way to do this. And technology is changing, you're changing, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts about how we can serve you better. Please reach out, email us, hello@smarternews.com. We absolutely love hearing from you, and you're our inspiration for doing what we do. So thank you. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and thank you for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News.